I watched the official reports come back from battalion, and they did not match what I had written in my ledger. The men in my aid station were breaking down from cold and disease at rates the system refused to acknowledge, and I began keeping a second set of records, one that no one was supposed to see. When a visiting officer discovered what I was doing, he made it clear that my documentation threatened the chain of command more than it helped the men I was treating. I kept the ledgers anyway, hidden, knowing they would change nothing during the war. It took 50 years for anyone to listen to what I had written down in silence. In the winter of 1943, the 34th Infantry Division held a sector of the Italian mountains south of Cassino. Snow had begun falling in December, earlier than expected. The altitude made communication difficult, and supply lines stretched thin across valleys and switchback roads. Frostbite cases were rising faster than combat casualties. In this environment, a medical sergeant named James Whitmore began keeping records that would eventually contradict official casualty reports. Whitmore was not a surgeon or a specialist. He worked in the regimental aid station, a converted stone farmhouse that sat roughly midway between the forward companies and the battalion headquarters. He had arrived in North Africa in 1942 as a basic medic, trained quickly and sent forward with minimal ceremony. By the time he reached Italy, he had seen enough wounds and deaths to understand that paperwork and reality did not always align. He kept 2 records. One was official, one was his own. The official records came from battalion. They tracked confirmed killed in action, wounded in action, missing in action. Prisoners of war had their own category, but the farmhouse where Whitmore worked existed in a gray space. Men came through the door with trench foot so severe that amputation was only a question of timing. Others arrived with concussions from artillery that had not registered as wounds to anyone but Whitmore, who watched their eyes and their gait. Some soldiers had infections that would never appear on a standard casualty list because the men survived them and returned to duty, damaged but present. Whitmore began writing in a small ledger purchased with his own money from an Italian shopkeeper. The entries were sparse. Date, name, condition observed, outcome. He did not classify himself as a record keeper. He was performing a medical duty as he understood it. And the ledger was his attempt to maintain an accurate picture of the regiment's actual health. In January 1944, the regiment moved north into the mountains near Rapido. The weather worsened. The fighting became sustained and difficult. The regimental aid station received a steady flow of men. Some stayed for days. Others were patched and sent back to their units within hours. Whitmore expanded his notes. He began tracking not only immediate injuries, but also secondary conditions. A soldier with a leg wound who was also showing signs of severe infection. A man with multiple concussions from successive bombardments. Pneumonia cases emerging from the damp, cold conditions of the forward foxholes. The official casualty figures, which Whitmore saw when they were transmitted to battalion, did not account for these secondary effects. And a man could be lightly wounded, treated, and returned to duty, then listed as combat effective. But if that same soldier developed pneumonia 3 days later, the pneumonia was not classified as a war casualty. It was listed as a disease. The distinction mattered. Disease casualties reflected poorly on command and supply procedures. Combat casualties were accepted as inevitable. The incentive structure pushed toward minimizing disease cases. Whitmore's ledger recorded both. By February 1944, he had documented 43 cases of severe trench foot, 15 cases of pneumonia directly related to exposure in foxholes, 12 cases of what appeared to be acute dysentery from contaminated water, and numerous cases of what he termed shock reaction, soldiers who had received no visible wound but could no longer function as combatants. And the official casualty reports for the same period listed 17 wounded and 6 disease cases. The discrepancy troubled him. It was not a small error. It represented a fundamentally different picture of the regiment's condition. If the men he was treating were actually incapacitated at rates 2 or 3 times higher than the official reports indicated, then the regiment was weaker than command believed. Resources were being misallocated. Plans were being made on the basis of inaccurate information. He did not initially consider the ledger a form of resistance. He framed it to himself as documentation. Medical practice required records. He was maintaining records. The fact that his records contradicted official tallies was a secondary concern. By March 1944, Whitmore's ledger contained entries for over 200 cases spanning 4 months. He had become more systematic in his notation. He recorded not only condition, but also the soldier's unit, his rank, and the disposition, whether the man had been evacuated, returned to duty, or, in a few tragic instances, had died in the aid station. The ledger was becoming a shadow history of the regiment. It was also becoming dangerous to keep. A visiting officer from division headquarters, a major named Patterson, arrived at the aid station one afternoon to observe procedures. He was ostensibly conducting a routine inspection. Patterson moved through the farmhouse, examined the supplies, observed how Whitmore and the other medics were treating patients. He was professional and unremarkable. As he was leaving, he noticed Whitmore's ledger on a desk. Sean Patterson asked what it was. Whitmore hesitated. He could have claimed it was a simple inventory of medical supplies or a log of supply requests. Instead, he described it accurately. A record of patient cases treated at the aid station. Patterson asked to see it. Whitmore complied. The major spent several minutes examining the entries. He did not comment while reading. When he finished, he closed the ledger carefully and handed it back. He told Whitmore that the record was interesting, but that casualty reporting followed specific channels and specific formats. Division headquarters did not receive reports from aid stations. Reports came from battalion, which consolidated information and forwarded it through proper channels. Whitmore's ledger, while perhaps medically useful, was not an official document and should not be confused with official casualty reports. The message was clear without being stated explicitly. Discontinue this practice or face consequences. Whitmore did not immediately stop keeping the ledger, but the encounter with Patterson changed something. He became more careful about where he stored it. He stopped discussing it with the other medics. He began spacing out his entries, writing less frequently and in a more abbreviated style. Some nights he considered destroying it entirely. By April 1944, the regiment was pulled back for a period of relative rest and reorganization. Whitmore's aid station caseload decreased. The tempo of combat eased. It was during this quieter period that a colonel named Henry Sanderson arrived from regiment to conduct an informal inspection of the aid station. So Sanderson was the regimental surgeon, a career officer who had served in the previous war and carried himself with the authority of long experience. Sanderson spent more time in the aid station than Patterson had. He asked Whitmore detailed questions about supply procedures, about infection rates, about the physical condition of men returning from frontline duty. Whitmore answered carefully. Sanderson seemed genuinely interested in understanding the realities of field medicine. On Sanderson's second visit, he asked directly about Whitmore's records. How was Whitmore tracking case outcomes? What documentation was he maintaining? The question had an accusatory quality, but Sanderson's tone remained neutral. Whitmore showed him the ledger. He explained that it was a personal medical record, not an official casualty report, and he used it to track trends that might inform treatment decisions. Sanderson examined it with the same careful attention Patterson had shown, but Sanderson's response was different. He told Whitmore that the ledger was valuable, not as an official report, but as a tool for understanding the actual health status of the regiment. He said that regimental surgeons often lacked the granular data that aid station medics could provide. He asked Whitmore if he would be willing to make a summary report based on the ledger data. Not an official report. A brief summary that Sanderson could use in his own assessment of regimental medical requirements. Whitmore agreed cautiously. Sanderson asked him to compile a summary covering January through April, breaking down categories of injury and disease, noting trends. Whitmore did so, and he spent several evenings in late April preparing a neat summary in a separate document. He kept the numbers exact. He did not inflate or minimize. He simply presented what the ledger contained. When he handed the summary to Sanderson, the colonel read it in silence. He told Whitmore that the data was stark. The regiment was suffering from more disease and secondary trauma than official reports indicated. Food quality was poor. Sanitation in the forward positions was inadequate. The clothing issued for mountain winter conditions was insufficient. Sanderson said he would use this information in his recommendations to division. Whitmore felt a moment of vindication. Someone in authority now possessed accurate information. Changes might follow. The men might receive better supplies. The medical care might be better resourced. Oh, nothing visibly changed. The supply situation did not improve. The clothing issued remained inadequate. In May, as the regiment moved toward the next major operation, Whitmore noticed that the new orders made no mention of additional medical personnel or equipment. Division had received his summary, presumably, but Division had not acted on it. Or Division had acted according to priorities that made Whitmore's data less important than other factors. The next major operation was the breakout from the casino sector. In May 1944, the 34th Division participated in attacks that were intended to break the stalemate in the mountains and valleys south of the Abbey. The fighting was brutal. The regiment lost significant numbers of men. Whitmore's aid station handled more casualties in 2 weeks than it had in the previous 3 months combined. During this intense period, Whitmore had no time to maintain his ledger with the previous care. He worked nearly continuously, treating wounds, managing infection, preparing men for evacuation. The ledger entries became sporadic. He recorded the most severe cases and deaths, but many of the secondary conditions went undocumented. The pace of casualty treatment overwhelmed his system. By early June, the regiment had broken through and was advancing toward Rome. The crisis period had passed. Whitmore had an opportunity to review what had happened. Looking at his ledger, he saw a clear pattern. The men had arrived at the breakout operation weakened by months of disease and exposure. They had fought anyway, because soldiers fight when ordered. But some of the losses that occurred, Whitmore believed, would not have occurred if the regiment had been in better condition, if the trench foot cases had been evacuated and healed rather than redeployed, if pneumonia had been treated with better resources, if food and shelter had been less inadequate. This was not something Whitmore could prove. It was not something he could state in an official report, but it was his clinical impression based on the data he had kept. The ledger had documented not only cases, but also a cascade of preventable suffering. Whitmore made a decision. He would attempt to present his findings more formally. He would request a meeting with Sanderson and propose a more structured effort to track and report medical trends. Perhaps if the data were organized clearly enough, decision-makers at higher levels would act on it. And he wrote a brief memorandum to Sanderson in mid-June, after the regiment had consolidated its position near Rome. He outlined his intention to compile quarterly medical summaries for the regimental surgeon's use. He offered to continue the detailed ledger work and produce summary reports that could inform supply and personnel decisions. Sanderson's response came a week later. He thanked Whitmore for his initiative, but he explained that the regimental surgeon's office had received direction from division that casualty reporting was to follow established channels exclusively. Ad hoc reports from individual aid stations, even when medically sound, created confusion in the administrative system. Sanderson appreciated the data, but he could not accept formal summary reports from Whitmore. What Whitmore did in his spare time, as a personal record, was his own business, but it must not become an official channel of communication. The message was a refined version of Patterson's earlier warning. The information Whitmore possessed was valuable, but the system did not want it. The system wanted clean lines of authority, clean categories. Casualty reports that fit existing frameworks. A medic's independent observation, no matter how accurate, disrupted administrative procedures. And administrative procedures, it seemed, took priority over granular truth. Whitmore continued keeping the ledger, but he understood now that it would not change anything. It was a private record, maintained for his own clarity and conscience. He stored it carefully, kept it out of sight, and told no one else about it. When the regiment moved on from Rome, he carried the ledger with him. The regiment fought through southern France in August and September 1944. Whitmore continued his documentation, though less systematically than before. The intensity of combat varied. Supply lines improved as the division advanced away from the Mediterranean and toward the Rhone Valley. The disease rates, Whitmore noted, did begin to decrease as conditions improved. But the improvement came from her conditions, not from any policy change. By October 1944, Whitmore had filled most of the original ledger. He had also begun a second one. The entries had evolved. They were less detailed than they had been in Italy. He recorded the essential information: name, unit, condition, outcome, but not always the surrounding context. The act of documentation had become routine, almost ritualistic. He knew that no one would read the ledgers except himself, yet he also knew that keeping them was technically in violation of his understanding with Sanderson and the implicit warnings from Patterson. But Whitmore had concluded that he would continue anyway. The ledgers were not hurting anything. They were not being shared. They were not interfering with official channels. They were his private attempt to maintain an accurate record of what he witnessed. In November 1944, the regiment was moved to the Vosges Mountains in eastern France. The conditions were harsh. Winter came early and cold. Casualties mounted. Whitmore's aid station received men with wounds that would have been treated differently in a well-supplied setting. He did what he could with what he had. He continued his ledger. It was in the Vosges that Whitmore's documentation nearly became public. The regiment was dug in and holding a mountain position. In December, a general visited the regiment, Eisenhower or one of his staff officers. Whitmore did not remember exactly. During the visit, the general wanted to meet with enlisted men and junior NCOs to get a sense of morale and conditions. Several medics were included in the informal interviews. Whitmore was asked about medical conditions in the regiment. He gave a careful official answer, noting the number of treatment cases and the general status of men. The general asked follow-up questions. Were there recurring medical problems? Any trends Whitmore had noticed? Whitmore hesitated. He could give the safe answer, or he could speak what he knew. The presence of the general's aide, taking notes, suggested this conversation would be recorded and reported. Speaking honestly might mean his information would actually reach someone with authority. He told the general that he had noticed consistent problems with trench foot and cold injury that seemed related to inadequate equipment and living conditions. He mentioned that men were returning to duty before wounds had fully healed because of manpower pressure. He described disease rates that seemed higher than necessary given the available supplies. The general listened. He asked for specific numbers. Whitmore provided them from memory, being careful not to cite his ledger directly. When the interview concluded, the general thanked Whitmore and moved on. The encounter left Whitmore anxious. He had spoken out of turn, outside the proper channels. No one had explicitly forbidden him to speak to a visiting general, but he had criticized conditions without authorization. He half expected some form of retribution, a reassignment, a reprimand, a more serious charge. Nothing happened. The weeks passed. The regiment continued operations. No inquiry was launched into Whitmore's comments to the general. He concluded that the remarks had either not been recorded or had been noted and then filed away without action. The system had filtered his words, as it had filtered his ledgers. Information could be provided, but the system would accept only what it was prepared to accept. By spring 1945, the war in Europe was clearly ending. The regiment was advancing into Bavaria. Casualties had decreased. The tempo of combat had slowed. Whitmore's work as a medic was becoming less intense. He had time to reflect on what he had documented over nearly 2 years. When he had filled multiple ledgers, thousands of individual case notes, patterns, trends, a detailed picture of one regiment's actual medical and physical status throughout the Italian and French campaigns. None of it had been officially used. None of it had changed policy or procedure at any level. But it existed. It was accurate. It was a record. In May 1945, the war ended. The regiment was in Austria, preparing for occupation duties. Whitmore was eligible for rotation home. He had enough points, a combination of rank, time in service, and combat participation. He was offered the choice to go home or stay with the regiment. He chose to go home. Before leaving, he faced a decision about the ledgers. They were officially his personal property. No regulation required him to surrender them, but they contained medical information about individual soldiers. In theory, they could be considered privileged medical records. In practice, Whitmore knew that if he left them with the regiment, they would likely be destroyed or filed away and forgotten. He decided to keep them. They were his documentation, and he wanted to preserve them. He packed them carefully and brought them home to the United States. Whitmore returned to civilian life in June 1945. He used his GI Bill benefits to attend college. He eventually became a nurse, completing additional education and certification. He worked in hospitals and clinics for decades. He never forgot the regimental aid station in Italy. He never quite let go of the belief that accurate medical documentation should inform policy. Over the decades, while he occasionally considered publishing his ledgers or donating them to a military archive, but he hesitated. The soldiers whose names filled the ledgers had expected privacy. Their medical information, even after decades, seemed like something that should not be made public without consent. Additionally, Whitmore was uncertain whether the ledgers would have any historical value or whether they would simply be shelved in an archive and forgotten. The ledgers remained in Whitmore's possession. He stored them in a fireproof box in his home. He did not share them widely. A few close friends and family members knew of their existence, but most people who knew Whitmore in his civilian life had no idea that he carried this documentation with him. In the 1980s, as oral history projects began proliferating and as historians became more interested in granular records of wartime experience, Whitmore was approached by a researcher. The researcher had been interviewing veterans and had heard from someone who knew Whitmore that he possessed detailed medical records from his service. The researcher asked if he might examine the ledgers. Whitmore was cautious at first. He explained his reservations about making the soldiers' medical information public. But the researcher assured him that the historical value of the records lay not in the individual names, but in the aggregate data and trends. The researcher proposed using the ledgers to understand the actual health conditions of frontline troops in a way that official records could not reveal. After consideration, Whitmore agreed to allow the researcher to examine the ledgers. The researcher spent time with the documents, photographing pages and taking notes. The researcher eventually produced an article in a military history journal analyzing Whitmore's data. The article demonstrated significant discrepancies between official casualty reports and the comprehensive documentation Whitmore had maintained. The article generated modest attention in academic circles. It was cited in subsequent books about field medicine in World War II. Historians recognized that Whitmore's ledgers represented a valuable primary source, documenting actual conditions that official records had obscured or minimized. More researchers contacted Whitmore. Eventually, he agreed to donate the ledgers to the U.S. Army Medical Department History Office, and where they became part of the archival collection. Access was restricted to researchers, and the individual soldiers' names were treated as confidential information. But the aggregate data and trends were preserved and made available to scholars. Whitmore continued his nursing career until his retirement in 1995. He gave occasional talks to medical students about the importance of maintaining accurate records and about the gap between official documentation and clinical reality. He described his experiences as a medic in World War II, though he did not publicly elaborate on the ledgers until near the end of his life. In his last interviews, conducted when he was in his 90s, Whitmore spoke more openly about his decision to keep the ledgers. He framed it not as an act of rebellion, but as a medical duty. And a medic's responsibility was to the soldiers he treated. Recording what he observed was part of that responsibility. That the records had contradicted official reports was a secondary consequence, not the primary intent. Whitmore died in 2003 at the age of 91. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his long career as a nurse and his service in World War II. It did not mention the ledgers. The ledgers remain in the Army Medical Department archive. They are consulted occasionally when historians researching field medicine and casualty documentation in World War II. They have contributed to a more nuanced understanding of how disease and secondary trauma affected frontline troops and how official casualty reporting sometimes underestimated the actual burden on soldiers' health. If the impact of Whitmore's documentation was delayed and indirect. During the war, the ledgers changed nothing. No policy was altered. No additional resources were allocated based on Whitmore's data. The system rejected the information because the information did not fit existing categories and procedures. The system functioned according to its own logic, not according to the clinical observations of a single medic. But the ledgers persisted. They outlasted Whitmore's service. They outlasted Whitmore himself. And decades after they were created, they provided evidence of truths that official records had concealed. A medic's private documentation, maintained at personal risk and in quiet defiance of institutional pressure, eventually found an audience, Not immediately, not during the war, but eventually. The silence in the official records was broken only when someone paid attention to what had been kept private. Whitmore had understood, probably from the beginning, that his ledgers would not change the war. But he maintained them anyway. That was the small, consequential act. Not that the act succeeded in its immediate objective, but that the act was made and the record was kept, regardless of whether anyone was listening. The ledgers documented not only the cases themselves, but also the distance between what commanders believed and what was actually happening in the field. That distance was not small. It was the gap between administrative truth and clinical truth. Whitmore lived in that gap for 2 years. He documented what he saw. And eventually, decades later, his documentation mattered.